While modern thought may want to dismiss the concept of magic, it's important to recognize that magic was very much a part of the medieval world. In fact, magic was closely intertwined with religion. Similar to modern day science, magic was used as a way to interpret the world. It was a different type of knowing and understanding, and just because it involves the supernatural, magic as a form of understanding does not make it any less valuable. This talk will be split into 3 different sections. Section 1 will explain what medieval ritual magic and necromancy was. It will also provide cultural context for why necromancy and ritual magic was particularly attractive to monks and friars. Section 2 will discuss French Benedictine monk John of Morigny and the historical context surrounding his autobiography and magical text. Additionally, I will talk about a medieval monk from Devon, England, Richard Dove of Buckfast Abbey, and his university notebook containing magical rituals. In Section 3, we will have some fun. I'll tell some stories about medieval necromancer monks, describe some real-life medieval magical rituals, and why their practitioners believe they worked. Section 1, Misconceptions about necromancy. Before we begin, it's important to know what necromancy meant for medieval people. When I say necromancy, you might imagine someone conjuring up the dead. This isn't necessarily true. In the Middle Ages, necromancy was associated with conjuring spirits. Spirits meaning supernatural beings such as demons, angels, fairy, jinn, and earthly spirits. Spirits here being a kind of vague catch-all term for anything supernatural. If the necromancer got caught, he had somewhat plausible deniability that he wasn't conjuring demons. But they didn't really summon the ghosts of dead humans all that much. Necromancy, as summoning the dead, is more of an ancient Greek and then early modern term. But in the Middle Ages, I'm specifically talking about ritual magic, as I just explained. What is necromancy anyway? Necromancy is a type of ritual magic. Francis Timbers describes ritual magic as a type of ceremonial magic that, quote, depended on rituals, often derived from Christian liturgy, to draw down otherworldly powers, unquote. Necromancy used liturgical elements as well as animal sacrifices in some case, amongst other ingredients we'll get into later. Practitioners were required to fast and remain celibate for a period of time before and during the process. It was also necessary to be educated properly to conjure demons and perform ritual magic as the texts were in Latin, even if sometimes the Latin was poor. As a result, only educated men, such as scholars and clergy, could read the texts. There is one female exception, but we will get into that later. Johann Hartlib's 1456 text, Book of All Forbidden Arts, calls necromancy, quote, the worst of all, unquote. The forbidden arts, quote, because it involves sacrifice and service one must do to the devils, unquote. And in doing so, the necromancer, quote, denies God and renders to the devils divine honor, unquote. Despite this, necromancy was very appealing to priests, monks, and friars. Wait, didn't the church burn witches? But wait, didn't authorities execute witches? Yes and no. In the Middle Ages, authorities executed heretics, but not really witches. Proper witch hunts began in the 15th century, thus the late Middle Ages. What popular culture thinks of a witch hunt mainly occurred in the 16th century, or even the late 17th century if you're familiar with the Massachusetts Salem witch trials. Also, necromancers are not witches. Generally speaking, 99.9999999, etc. percent of medieval necromancers were men, and most accused witches were women, keyword there being most. There were some exceptions. One particularly rare exception to the necromancy is for boys rule is Benedictine monk John of Morigny's sister Bridget. When Bridget was 15, she asked John to teach her how to read. He didn't want to, but Bridget wore him down, good for her, and he taught her how to read with the Ars Notoria. His justification for using a magical text was he, quote, considered that she might be able to succeed by means of the Ars Notoria in knowing how to read in a brief space of time, with her age not hindering her, and without hardship, unquote. Bridget excelled, and within about 6 or so months, she was able to write down everything she read and could sing, quote, an Alleluia perfectly all by herself, without help, as graciously as an angel, unquote. However, the major downside to this was that she was starting to get accosted by what John calls, quote, malign spirits, unquote, so demons. That's not to say no one in the Middle Ages was accused of magic. They were. But witch trials were way more common later on. When people were accused of magic in the Middle Ages, it was often attack on crime after a list of other more reliable and serious accusations. And when necromancers were caught, their punishments were pretty light, depending on what they were doing. For example, if you were using magic to predict the death of the king, such as in the case of the Oxford astronomer John Stacey, who worked with the Duke of Clarence, George Plantagenet, it was over. You committed treason, you were dead. You were going to be executed. No questions asked about that, unless, you're the person asking questions during the trial, but that's neither here nor there. But if you were like the priest, Otto Sinboden, and used necromancy to find stolen money, then you could be pardoned by the Pope. Basically, unless you directly hurt someone, you were probably not going to be executed. The Church's attitudes towards magic. Around the 13th century, the Church became more concerned about magic. Before the 13th century, they were worried, but it wasn't really a pressing concern. The official Church position on magic was that it wasn't real, and it was just people being deceived by the devil. Starting in the 14th century, the Church kind of started focusing on it. Overall, the Catholic Church was much more focused on heresy than magic. Pope John the 22nd is an early example of church authorities actually being concerned about magic. In the early 1300s, Pope John the 22nd thought that the Bishop of Cahors tried to kill him using magic. Then he thought the ruler of Milan and his son tried to kill him with magic. So he decided that anyone who used magic would be excommunicated unless they repented. However, a magician would either need to be caught or suspected of doing magic before they were excommunicated. If necromancers were subtle and secret, as they were supposed to be, as necromancy was supposed to be secret, or they just had a scholarly interest in it, as in they were just studying it but not actually doing it, they would be fine. Pope John the 22nd demanded church officials start investigating magicians. However, in the Middle Ages, the Inquisition's job was to investigate heretics. Based on the amount of letters John the 22nd wrote, the Inquisition did not take his requests too seriously. After all, at this time, magic was not considered heresy, so it wasn't their job. Widespread investigations of magic would come about much later. The clerical underworld. Why didn't the church take magic more seriously? Well, probably because a lot of clerics, monks included, read magical texts. Here I use the term cleric to refer to a man who has been ordained into the minor orders with the possible intention of becoming a priest. When a man went to university in the Middle Ages, he would be a cleric. A cleric could also be someone who helped a priest at Mass, work as a doorkeeper, a lector, an acolyte, etc. These clerics were part of what Richard Kieckhefer termed the clerical underworld. The clerical underworld was a network of clerics who shared magical texts with one another. Often texts would be exchanged while clerics attended university. In theory, this was secret. In practice, the clerical underworld was much more public than practitioners wanted to admit. The Sworn Book of Honorius stresses how important secrecy is. It also claims 98 master magicians gathered together to create the book when they were being persecuted. Additionally, one of its rituals says up to 7 people can do it. So not very secret at all. Benedictine monk John of Morigny's experiences as a necromancer also imply a lack of extreme secrecy. He interacts with several other necromancers while in his monastery and while studying at university. They recommend magic books to read, where to find them, or even lend him books. There is a camaraderie between practitioners who are happy to assist others within the magical subculture. Of course, necromancers probably tried to keep what they were doing somewhat secret to non-magicians to a certain extent. After all, there are records of people hiring people to do magic for them. But what happened in necromancer circles mostly stayed in necromancer circles. Mostly. Thanks to John of Morigny's autobiography, we do know a lot about the clerical underworld from a reliable primary source. Some of their sources are exempla, which are stories told for sermons, but those aren't, I wouldn't really consider those a reliable primary source because the stories are not coming from the necromancers themselves. They're usually coming from a cleric or a priest or whoever is writing the exempla, who is presumably not a necromancer to teach their congregation about, oh, this is why you don't do this sin, X, Y, and Z. Devil's Sacrament Principle. While there are legal cases of monks, friars, and other clergy being accused of magic, there are not as many as you might think. I believe this is due to what I would like to term the Devil's Sacrament Principle. This term comes from this meme on the slideshow. Basically, the reason clerics weren't snitching on each other all the time was because they were also doing magic. Why did ritual magic appeal to clergy? Ritual magic was extremely appealing to priests, monks, and friars. Clergy and clerics were the most common type of person to get involved with necromancy. This is because they were educated, knew at least a little Latin, and had access to liturgical materials necessary for magical rituals. Liturgical materials include, but are not limited to, prayers, masses, altars, holy water, etc. It would be easier for a monk to know and obtain these materials than a secular person. Ritual magic was also a way for monks to perform secular masculinity. Desiring worldly things was in direct contrast to monastic life. Becoming a monk meant rejecting the world, but through necromancy, a monk could obtain treasures, horses, knowledge, and women. Of course, in theory, monks were supposed to be celibate. In practice, a lot of them were not, or at least more than the church would have liked to be. However, magical rituals did involve religious elements like fasting and celibacy, which also allowed monks to perform religious masculinity. Sometimes monks experimented with necromancy before they were monks, and sometimes while they were monks. The repentant necromancer was a common character in medieval literature. The repentant necromancer character is usually a scholar or a cleric who studied necromancy, had a magical ritual go very bad. He gets extremely traumatized by demons and joins the monastic life to repent for his sins. University life. Monks could learn magic at university. In theory, monks were supposed to stay in the cloister. In practice, they did leave. University was one place they were permitted and encouraged to go. In 1215 AD, the Fourth Lateran Council mandated monasteries educate their monks. However, monks studied at universities even before the Fourth Lateran Council. The Cistercian order often sent their monks away to study before 1215, even if arguably the most famous Cistercian monk of all, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, did not approve. However, abbots only occasionally sending monks to university to study changed rapidly after the Fourth Lateran Council. The Franciscans and the Dominicans also valued education and sent their friars to university. In 1246, the general chapter for the Black Friars decided that every prior should send 2 of their friars to university. Like many modern university students away from parental supervision and a rigid lifestyle, the taste of freedom was likely to be irresistible for monks, resulting in poor or at the very least questionable behavior. This involved dabbling in ritual magic and demon summoning. It was so prevalent that the University of Paris had to make a statement regarding magic studies amongst its scholars. In 1398, the Faculty of Theology put out a document explaining what was and was not magic. It has 28 separate articles and an extremely in-depth description of a magical circle. The amount of detail implies that this was something the Faculty of Theology had experience in. Now, the average life of the medieval scholar was not an easy one. University was not cheap. Monastic students struggled to finance their studies like secular students. Monks needed to acquire or commission someone to copy them their textbooks, find housing, and were often limited in what subjects they were actually allowed to study. Necromancy promised a cheap and supposedly easy way to learn. For example, the Ars Notoria promised to give the practitioner all the knowledge in the world. However, I read it, and performing it properly requires a lot of time and effort, and it would probably just be easier to actually do your homework. That being said, I also live during a time where I can go online and almost find almost any book that I want. Or if I can't find that exact book, there's a huge chance I can find it or something similar for free. Section 2. John of Morigny. In 1323, French authorities burned a book, but it wasn't any book. It was a magical book, or so the people burning it claimed. They said it was sorcery, heresy, false, evil, and against the Christian faith. However, if you asked its author, he said that not only was it perfectly legitimate, it was approved by the Virgin Mary herself. The burned book's author was a Benedictine monk named John of Morigny. John is one of the only named necromancer monks who wrote his own autobiography, has other contemporary sources backing up his claims, and wrote his own name in his magical text. John is an extremely rare example of a monastic necromancer we know by his name, and his occult text, Liber Florum, is a rare example of a medieval magical text who has an actually named author. Now, other magical texts do have named authors, however, these are likely to be pseudonyms, and aren't actually going to be the person who is writing its actual real name. In his autobiography, John describes his life as a monastic necromancer. While he was a poor university student, a cleric gave him an unspecified necromantic text. John copied what he could of the book. Eventually, a doctor encouraged his magical studies, and John acquired a copy of the Ars Notoria. This began his downward spiral into necromancy. He practiced necromancy for an unspecified period of time, during which he experienced many terrifying dreams and visions of the devil, demons, and other evil spirits. I will note, like our good friend John, I also experienced an unpleasant dream after reading the Ars Notoria, and I only read that for my dissertation, so make of that what you will. John attempted to give up necromancy, however, this was easier said than done. He relapsed several times and even started to write, quote, a book of mastery in the new necromancy, unquote. John reports that Jesus Christ himself punished him for this. In a dream, Christ ordered an angel to beat up John. The angel beat him so violently that when he woke up, he was still in pain. Eventually, John fully abandoned necromancy to craft a more legitimate and divinely approved method to gain academic and spiritual knowledge. John's claims are backed up by the Chronicle of St. Denis. The Chronicle states, in 1323, Parisian authorities condemned and burned a heretical book written by a monk of Morigny. The account describes John's claims that the Virgin Mary helped him and the book's contents, which matches surviving manuscripts of the Liber Florum. The Chronicle says the manuscript was illustrated with a lot of colors. While John's original book was burned, later manuscripts also containing the text match similar description. This suggests at least one monk's account of performing ritual magic actually occurred, giving credibility to the rest of John's account of the clerical underworld. After John's original text was burned, he rewrote it to be less questionable. Versions of the old text and the new text still survive to this day. Devon's magical monk, Richard Dove. If John's case is highly unusual due to how much survives and how much comes from his own words, let us now turn to Richard Dove of Buckfast Abbey. Richard's case is much more typical in the wider historical context of monastic necromancers. The majority of Richard's Dove life is lost to time. When Buckfast Abbey was first founded, it was a Benedictine monastery, as it is today. By the 15th century, however, it was run by the Cistercians. Richard Dove was one such Cistercian. Unfortunately, his home abbey of Buckfast does not have a record of him. We only know that he lived at all thanks to the Register of Edmund Stafford, which documents the days he was tonsured and ordained, and the notebook he kept as a student. There is some debate over whether or not he even attended Oxford, as there is no record of him there from any Cistercian-run colleges. However, his notebook contains oaths for studying at Oxford. It is possible Richard Dove attended either Rewley Abbey or St. Bernard's College at Oxford, but neither institution left any records of their students. Richard Dove's notebook is at the British Library under manuscript number Salone 513. It is not digitized by the British Library, but you can find a microfilm scan online. However, at this point in time, due to the British Library's cyber attack, a lot of the manuscripts that they had once digitized are no longer digitized, which is really unhelpful for when you want to do research, but that's neither here nor there. They are starting to upload manuscripts as of, 2025, but it's still annoying. His notebook contains several magical texts. There is a text for alchemy, fortune-telling with dice, palmistry, and the Ars Notoria. But does this mean that Richard Dove actually did any magical rituals? No, absolutely not. Occult texts were common enough in medieval monasteries as subjects for scholarly interest. St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury had many magical manuscripts, some of which still survive. Additionally, some texts were not as theologically questionable as the surviving demon-summoning manuscripts. A monk using the Ars Notoria for meditation and worship could justify it by saying that it was not conjuring demons, but angels. Many occult texts call the beings they conjure neither demons nor angels, but spirits. Whether or not conjurers believed they were actually summoning innocent spirits can be debated, but regardless, it was safer than calling them demons. It's also worth noting Richard's notebook contains texts that would make practicing ritual magic easier if he was. Again, if being the key word there. Richard's notebook contains texts about astronomy, including a text on the motion of the planets and moon. The Ars Notoria requires orations to be said at certain moon phases. Also, you need to know the moon and planets' movements for alchemy, as medieval people believed that metals were more potent depending on their locations. While it's not definite proof Richard Dove actually performed ritual magic, he had the means, the Ars Notoria and texts supplementing the right time to perform orations, and the circumstances, attending Oxford and living at a rural abbey in Devon, to do so. As his notebook is filled with other magical texts, even if Richard Dove never performed magic, perhaps the thought crossed his mind at least once. Section 3. Disclaimer. Now we've reached the really fun part. For the third section, I will discuss some magic rituals and stories about demon summoning monks and friars. Now, for health and safety reasons, I must stress that you should not try these rituals yourself. This is for entertainment purposes only, and I am not responsible for any injuries that anyone sustains if they try this at home and are dragged down to hell. Also, according to contemporary sources, if you do this, there is a very high chance a demon will attack you. If you're lucky, they might just drag you down to hell and a skilled necromancer can rescue you. If you aren't lucky, the demons will rip you to shreds. I am not a skilled necromancer. I do not know any skilled necromancers. All the professors I know only study magic in a scholarly way, so I don't know where to find one. And because you are online and not in front of me right now, in real life, well, if you do this, I can't help you. So don't try this at home. Great, let's continue. Medieval necromancer archetypes. Now, to really drive the point home, I will now discuss some stories about necromancy going very, very wrong. Each story I have chosen represents a necromancer archetype. We have the monk turned necromancer, the necromancer turned monk, and finally, the necromancer who is not a monk but does display a necromancer's mindset regarding ritual magic. The last one is particularly interesting because the story comes from a ritual magic texts, while the others come from texts written from a particularly religious context. Each story provides cultural context as to why interacting with demons was so dangerous. Julian the Monk. The first story is from the Golden Legend. The Golden Legend was an extremely popular collection of saints' biographies. However, sometimes it discusses stories unrelated to saints but have some kind of lesson in them. In the tale of Julian the Apostate, Julian is characterized as a monastic necromancer. As a child, he learned magic and could even summon demons. When he grew up, Julian became a monk. Typically in repentant necromancer stories, the character regrets his youthful wrongdoings and experimentations and is reluctant to practice again. Julian is not one of these characters. Instead, he gives up magic temporarily. He successfully convinces everyone that he is holy and pious. People trust him, and one woman trusts him so much that she gives him 3 jars of gold for safekeeping. She had covered the gold with ashes, but Julian quickly discovers the gold. Probably due to the weight, as we all know, gold is significantly heavier than ashes. Given the chance to enact his worldly desires, Julian runs away from the monastery with the gold. Eventually, he becomes the Emperor of Rome. As Emperor, Julian picks up magic again, and he uses demons as spies in his war against Persia. However, sometimes the demons are not particularly effective spies. They are easily stopped by any monk they come across praying. One demon is even stuck in one place for 10 days because a monk prayed in a clearing for 10 days and nights. Eventually, Julian is defeated when a Christian soldier he killed is resurrected by the Virgin Mary. The soldier kills Julian and disappears. Then the Persians turn Julian into a cushion. The Repentant Necromancer. Our second story comes from the Dialogue on Miracles. Scholars from many different regions were studying the art of sorcery in Toledo. A few German scholars heard stories about necromancy from their master and naturally wanted proof for themselves. Their master can summon demons, but is hesitant to do so in front of the scholars. Eventually, the scholars convince him. He takes them into a field at, quote, a suitable hour, and made a circle around them with a sword, warning them under the threat of death, unquote, to stay in the circle. He warns the scholars not to give anything or take anything from the beings that appear. Then the master summons a few demons. The demons appear and transform themselves into knights. The demon knights are armed and practice, quote, war games around the young men, unquote. They even start to pretend to fall and thrust their spears and swords at the scholars. However, this display of secular and chivalrous masculinity does not tempt any of the scholars outside the circle. So the demons try a different tactic. They transform into beautiful dancing women with gold rings. This is much more effective. One scholar's lust and greed is too much, and he sticks his finger outside of the circle and is immediately dragged down to hell. Needless to say, this is very upsetting for the scholar's friends. They threaten their master into saving their friend. The master summons demons and has to negotiate for the scholar's release with the devil himself. Once the traumatized scholar is safely back on Earth, he becomes a Cistercian monk. This story was written by the Cistercian monk Caesarius of Heisterbach. Naturally, it is a bit biased, but it does reflect wider religious concerns about medieval youths attending university. Concerns such as what scholars were learning and how masters were behaving. The Rawlinson Horse Summoner. In a demon horse summoning ritual, the practitioner is also not allowed to be unchaste. In the Rawlinson manuscript, the author explains that one time he took his demon horse to India and had relations with a woman there. When he was done, the practitioner tried to mount the horse to return home. After a struggle to mount his horse, it threw him 40 feet in the air and he broke his leg. He had to spend 4 months recovering in India. It was only after he went to confession, did penance for his sin, and bought a new scepter, sword, and ring for the summoning ritual could he resummon the horse. When the horse reappeared, the necromancer rode it around the world 8 times. It took a month to do so, and they only stopped to eat and sleep. It was his way of punishing the horse for throwing him, and the demon horse certainly felt punished. The horse told the necromancer he would rather be in hell than ride for so long, and to, quote, not cause him such grief anymore, unquote, and he would do what the necromancer wanted as long as he was, quote, clean, unquote. Chastity was a vital component of ritual magic. Besides being a monastic vow, chastity meant that a man had self-control over his bodily lust and sinful feelings towards other people. There is another story where a lecherous clerk summons a demon, and the demon tells the clerk that his lust smells so bad that they can't be around him, but if he stops for 3 days, then he'll return and do what the clerk wants. Now, with the demon horse summoning story, it's quite interesting. It does capture a lot of things that are common in these kinds of texts. So one of the things is you can't commit sins while interacting with demons. They won't obey, and you'll be punished for it, such as we see in the previous story with the clerk who sticks his finger outside the circle and is dragged back down to hell. This kind of relates to that there are consequences for lust, which is bodily injury, financial harm, and spiritual danger. And also this story really encapsulates the masculine brag, which is a common part of a lot of these rituals. And so the masculine brag is something that Frank Klassen termed, and it's basically a lot of these people who did these rituals have low self-esteem, likely, and want to seem super cool. And so, what other way to seem cool than I have my own horse, which is, kind of bragging like I have a Ferrari, I have a Corvette or whatever, because horses are expensive. I have my own horse. It summons, it's a demon horse. I can summon it. I can go to India. I can go across the world. You can't do that. I can do that. Look how super cool I am. So kind of like that with the masculine brag to kind of prove their superiority over their peers. Because, this is a lot of the times, again, as previously stated, a lot of the times it was university students or clerics doing it, magic. They were poor, low self-esteem kind of thing. This is a really great way to just brag about how super cool they were. Anyway, also another thing the story really shows is the lack of fact-checking. So it's like the necromancer goes to India to sleep with a woman, Why India? Well, if you're in Europe, it's really hard to prove that you don't have a girlfriend in India, or that you do have a girlfriend. And so, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, my girlfriend who lives in Canada, or she goes to a different school, you don't know her. So yes, that's just really interesting about this particular story. Ritual magic's goals. Before I discuss some occult texts, I would like to explain what they did and the ingredients they required. Magical texts did a variety of things. The Ars Notoria would give the practitioner all the knowledge of the academic and medical world through divine grace. The Sworn Book of Honorius would allow him to see God's face and command spirits. Various other texts had rituals to create illusions, find treasure, cause hatred between friends, kill enemies, love, quote, unquote, spells for women and men, obtain a horse, become invisible, cause someone to go insane, gain dignity and honor, resurrect a dead person, find a thief, tell the future, conjure the devil himself, etc. There are a lot more, but for the sake of time, I'm limiting it to these. Basically, the majority of these rituals were for worldly gain, things monks were not supposed to care about or want, in theory. Necromancy ingredients. Some ingredients were easier for clergy, monks, and friars to obtain than a secular person. Others were not. So some of these ingredients, I'm just going to read from the slideshow. So masses and other liturgical elements, such as prayers, placing items on an altar, holy sacraments, orations, etc., talismans, secrecy, knowledge of astronomy and astrology, suffumigation, I didn't pronounce that right, but oh well, a boy's fingernail for divination, swords, fire, various plants. There's too many to list. There's so many plants. There's just so many. Various animals for sacrifices, mandrakes, nuts, wax, etc. There are just a lot of ingredients that I just don't have time to explain them all. Maybe in another video I'll go into them in further detail if people want to, if you're still watching this far. So please do let me know if you'd like me to talk a little bit more about whatever subject. Anyway, Ars Notoria. The Ars Notoria was one of the most popular ritual magic texts for monks. Strictly speaking, the Ars Notoria is a theurgic text. This means it claimed to summon angels instead of demons. However, medieval church authorities still thought it was questionable, thus they were suspicious of it. The Ars Notoria does not explicitly invoke demons, but because it calls upon unknown names, there were fears that the angels were actually demons. So it was too close to other forms of magic for comfort. The Ars Notoria is composed of orations that resemble any other prayer if one does not look carefully. The contemporary controversy places the Ars Notoria in an odd place between religious worship and ritual magic, but its contents did not help its conflicting reputation. The Ars Notoria promises things useful for struggling monastic scholars and monks in general. Allegedly, if you do the orations properly, you can attain knowledge of all the liberal arts, eloquence, a better memory, the grace of the Holy Spirit, stability, lost wisdom, strengthening your senses, ridding yourself of all lust, etc. However, the Ars Notoria also contains worldly knowledge that would not be out of place in an explicitly demonic ritual magic texts, such as knowing if someone was a virgin or not. Did magic actually work? So belief is a powerful thing. Ritual magic texts insist spirits will only come to practitioners who truly believe in it. And when a person goes out looking for the supernatural, they are likely to find it. It also helps when the rituals involve mind-altering substances. For example, several rituals in the text Pictrix involve suffumigations with ingredients known to cause psychological and physical effects such as opium, wormwood, alcohol, and nutmeg. In the Sworn Book of Honorius, one ritual to raise up spirits encourages pre-gaming, drinking a copious amount of alcohol during the ritual, fumigating and suffumigating a magic circle for an unspecified amount of time. The ritual can also be done with up to 7 other companions. So when with other people, one is more likely to agree with the group. So if the practitioners did not see anything at first, by the end, when they were drunk, high, and with their friends, they were likely to have seen something, or at least thought they saw something. In conclusion, the image of all monks being holy and pious is not an accurate one. Of course, some monks were holy and pious, but just as many were not, and some of them were even necromancers. So I just want to say thank you if you've made it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy talking about necromancy and monks and monastic life. I'm trying to decide what my next video should be on. So if you have any suggestions, please do let me know, or at least my next academic video, as you know, I might make a book review. I'm not sure, because just researching everything does take a lot of time. Anyway, if you would like to see more, like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. You know how this works. It's YouTube. You can do what you want. I'm not your dad. And so, yeah, I hope you have a good one. Bye. And I also hope you learned something.